Hello. In this, the first episode of Heirs for Architecture's 2025 offer, I was joined by the extraordinary architect, writer, theorist and educator Bernard Tschumi, whose work has helped define the context of architecture, architects and the contemporary city as much as anyone in the profession. We discuss a tiny bit of this, focusing on his recent book, Event Cities 5, Poetics. The book, published by MIT Press in November 2024, is the fifth and final volume of a series that stretches back to 1994, documenting his practice's work since Event Cities 4 in 2010. This conversation felt very special to me. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed recording it.
Heirs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Heirs for Architecture. I'm delighted to be talking today to Professor Bernard Tschumi, storied architect. Bernard, I can't believe that anybody needs an introduction to you. However, as this is the way we work, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Wow. Yeah, I'm an architect.
Yeah.
I happen to think that architecture is a relatively, simultaneously a very complex and a very simple thing. And it's about thought, it's about material and building, and a lot of things over the last 3,000 or 4,000 years are still worth investigating and in a state of change. And if I was to introduce myself, I would say, yes, the questions and the investigation is just as much part of the job as putting the pieces together. And so, amusingly enough, I decided fairly late in terms of when people decide what they're going to do, although it was at the age of just before the age of 18, in Chicago, visiting the city and discovering an enormous excitement in this urban environment. I insist on the urban environment before the building themselves. The buildings were just, if you want, the icing on the cake. It was a fascination which took over any other interest that I had in literature, philosophy, and other art forms. So the reason why I start with this is that in a way that enthusiasm has not died down over now several decades or even more, and that it's about a culture. What I keep saying, it's not about a knowledge of form, but a form of knowledge, and everything proceeded from that.
What do you mean by a form of knowledge? That's quite a lovely inversion.
Well, there are forms of knowledge which are entirely abstract, say certain branches of mathematics, for example, potentially philosophy as well, and many others. The particularity of architecture is that it's simultaneously about abstract thought and about materiality, about putting it together. And this extraordinary particularity still fascinates me. I use the word concept a lot, simply because there are certain things which have to be invented. I often use the example of montage in cinema. Without montage, there is no cinema. Or without the concept of the unconscious, there is no psychoanalysis. And I would say that architecture, because of its particularity of being simultaneously concept and materiality, is one of those unusual arts that constantly provokes and challenges the mind.
Yes. And that's very evident in your body of work, which is quite unique in architects, which is that it's both built and hugely written and deeply rooted in philosophy. Still, you haven't abandoned philosophy in favor of a kind of utilitarian approach to getting stuff up.
It's nice you say that. I could formulate it a different way, which is the questions are always there, and they're stimulating. They're very exciting. In the office, we do a lot of competitions. The reason we do that is that I find much more exciting to get a job through a design rather than through public relations and other sort of business mechanisms. Which means that since you don't win them all, you don't build all of it, but every part of it, every part of those projects is part, I won't say it's a bit much, although it is, but it's also a way to spend all one's time developing a certain body of thinking, and therefore every piece of work that's done in the office is actually part of that investigation, this questioning. Interestingly enough, since we are talking about books in this particular case, and of course I can't resist, showing the latest one, every piece of it is a way to attempt to understand exactly what one is doing, right? Of course, these days I've been very tempted to quote Susan Sontag and her famous "I write in order to know what I think." I can say I design in order to, or I built in order to know what I think. So that notion has meant that the Event Cities, the series, was exactly this. There's amusingly enough, I can't resist turning this around and show you a few books that I just put on the table. There are two kinds of books. There's the one in the back, which are specifically subject related. But the Event Cities series was there as a documentation, almost that preceded the notion of archives. In other words, not simply to say, there's this, and that. No, not at all. It was simply to try to see what was the thread and what kind of an overview one could have either on the past work or the current work and potentially issues that would become future work. So the 5-volume of Event Cities were specifically done in order to formulate those questions and see to which extent the project themselves were part of the answer. So indeed, I do believe strongly about that, the architecture as a form of knowledge.
Yes. Yes. You were raised in an architectural family. Your father was a famous modernist architect, Jean Tschumi. So you were kind of encouraged in that. Were you born in Switzerland or in France?
I was born in Lausanne, in a French-speaking part. Spent a fair amount of my youth before the age of 10 in Paris, but going back and forth between Paris and Lausanne, just as my father, Jean Tschumi, had an office in Paris and an office in Lausanne, and went back, and he was involved first with the School of Architecture. He founded the School of Architecture at the EPFL, which was not called the EPFL then. So, yes, I was very aware of these surrounding. His office, which was at first a small office, was in the apartment, and both in the Paris office or in the Lausanne office. And on Sundays, regularly, I would be taken on the sort of Sunday promenade from the age of 5 or 6 on building sites, on construction sites. So all that was, to me, a sort of general background, right? As it happens, often people ask me whether I had conversation about architecture with Jean Tschumi. I actually hardly did. He died, strangely enough, on my 18th birthday, and we never had time to discuss architecture, barely. But traveling and visiting cities, whether it was say Florence or Venice or certain castles in France and so on, was that I was, reasonably not informed, that's too much, but I had somehow of a general background. And eventually, my interests were more in the questioning and the literary and actually cinema and this type of things. But then, as I mentioned to start with, it happened when I was struck by an incredible, a city that had the power to change my mind in a way.
Yes, as you've mentioned, and you've only shown the front page of it. So for people who listen to this as an audio, that will be difficult to see. But the subject, I suppose, of our conversation, or the orientation of it, is around Event Cities 5 Poetics, which came out with MIT Press in November, I believe.
Yes.
And it's the fifth of a series that spanned quite a few decades now. And the last one, Event Cities 4, came out in 2010. And
yes.
a lot has happened since then. What was the imperative? What was the motivation specifically in Event Cities 5? Was it always planned? Was there always this intention, or did you feel that there was a new thing to say, a new way of a new prism to look at your work through?
Immediate answer, both. But let me backtrack. In the first actual building project dates from the early 80s. It's, of course, the Parc de la Villette. And in 1994, I was asked to have a retrospective exhibition of at MoMA, New York, covering a relatively short period of time, basically hardly more than 10 years. And at that time, there was, of course, La Villette, but there were a number of other projects that were not built yet. And I thought it was interesting to put them together. Actually, I had already started for something else, to put them together in this format of 600 or 640 pages that would cover not only the final results, but the actual thinking process. And that, amusingly enough, that first volume, I was publishing at the same time a thinner one, which was a number of articles and pieces of writing that I had put together under the title Architecture and Disjunction. MIT Press was publishing it. And I discussed it with the editor, the chief editor then, Roger Conover, who at one moment we talked about the MoMA show, and he and I said, would you be interested to publish that Even Cities? At the time, it didn't even have number one. And Roger hesitated. He said, that's not what MIT Press does. MIT Press does book about writings, about, words. And then he kept thinking, listening to me, and he said, well, we do at MIT Press textual discourse, but maybe how's about the project discourse? And I love the word project discourse. And so that first thick book was started a series, but at the time I didn't think about a series. Mm-hmm. 4 years later, we had enough material to do then what became Even Cities 2. And 5 years later, there was another Even Cities 3. And then by then we were 2010, and that was Even Cities 4. Almost every 5 years, and always the same format, like a sort of, by then it was very intentional to have that documentation. And then there were nearly 15 years without one. And the reason was that there was so much work. And then also I published that massive so-called, architecture, red is not a color. And that particular very illustrated book was trying to make a general, more, let's say, less specialized, more accessible book, except it's so big and so thick and so expensive that I don't think that, I had a discussion with another publisher then, Rizzoli, and I wanted it to be on thin paper, like Bible paper, but they wanted to do it as a massive sort of monument. So it came out as a monument, but as it took a lot of time, it delayed the final Even Cities, the Even Cities 5. And Even Cities 5, I called it the final one, simply because I wanted to be able to control the narrative, dare I say, and not to have a number of things that were loose ends. Maybe there will be loose ends, you don't know how long you live. But these putting together 15 years of work in the same type of format took a lot of time. It was actually probably the first Even Cities. They wouldn't take more than 4 to 6 months to put together. This one took over 2 years, almost 3, because there you had to choose and to decide what was, the overall argument. Not anymore the argument of that particular volume, but actually all 5.
I see.
That's what made it an incredible challenge. Also, amusingly enough, the first 2 volumes are in black and white or in black and red. And then by number 3 and 4, we were using some color, but color was expensive then. And today it is much easier. And the last volume is every other page, or every other spread is lavish colors.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a wonderful thing it's a wonderful resource that you've kind of handed out to the world, I suppose, and that reflective quality in it, that interrogation of your own work and reflexive design practices. Well, I mean, it's obviously a great example, I think, to thoughtful practice. But you mentioned Parc de la Villette, and I adore that project. I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and I teach around it. And it's sort of, for me, and maybe you can correct me here, but for me it seems to embody postmodernism perhaps better than almost any other building or any other built work that I can think of or I've encountered. But you come from this modernist background. Your father is a modernist, was a modernist. How did this postmodern sensibility, so beautifully encapsulated at Parc de la Villette, where did it come from? What stimulated it in your own thinking? Was it an emergent concept that you drew from these other disciplines, from art practice and philosophy and so on, and movie making?
Yes, I think that's a very important question, because it's simultaneously about, let's put it this way, my own trajectory, but also the trajectory of part of my own generation. I'll backtrack a little bit. You use the word modernism. In the 60s and leading to the 68 sort of explosion, there were a number of questions which were raised in not only in architecture, but in all cultural fields, in literature, in art, in philosophy, and so on. And these questions were the general, say, mood that preceded the 68 general sort of, how can I say, storm. What happened in architecture at the time, that a whole sort of set of beliefs that had been generated by the modernist period were under question. And much of the answer was, as you certainly know or may remember, that that notion of going back to history, rediscovering history, which modernism did not quite approach in the same manner, led to that period of quote-unquote postmodernist sensibilities, and for better or worse, better in terms as in the art scene, for example, re-questioning the idea of figuration, of representation, as opposed to the previous version of abstraction. In architecture, something else happened at the same time that confused a little bit the discourse, which was the fact of so-called historicism, postmodernism, historicism. You remember that period. Certainly in Anglo-Saxon countries, we all remember the early Prince Charles and Leon Krier, sorry. And so hence there was a sort of slight embarrassment about what architecture was producing then, and an interest. And now I will subdivide my own trajectory and a few others, a few other people. In my own case, in that early investigation, which was purely in the form of writing and teaching was an incredible tool about raising questions and having almost a laboratory, which was you had a dozen students, and every semester or over the period of a year or two, you could really raise a whole series of issues, play devil's advocate, which I love to do. And so that was more, but then in that trajectory, which was simultaneously political interest, literary interest, and art-related interest, that's what led me to New York. I went from London to New York. Yeah, there would be an interesting little footnote about why did I go to London. Yes, I will. You right
please
now.
tell me, yeah, please.
Again, I mentioned 68. The architectural scene has completely imploded then, right? And the only place where there's something seemed to be happening was actually in London. And a few conversations that I was interested in particular Cedric Price, with whom I was hoping to get a job, and then the job didn't materialize, except we had a lot of great exchanges with Cedric. And I because of these conversations around the corner, I happened to walk at the right moment into the members' room at the AA, and they hired me. But that's a longer conversation. And so, but that is important because these, and the word conversation, which was a word that Alvin Boyarsky loved to use, was something that extended to the art scene. The art scene in New York seemed to be even more sort of challenging. And I went to New York from London after 6 years teaching at the A, went to New York and actually thinking it was simply a stopover before going back to Paris, which I felt were my cultural roots. But New York caught me, and I ended up spending the rest of my life commuting between Paris and New York 1 week per month or 2 weeks per month. But that's, I'm diverging. The main point is that that was my own trajectory of introducing a discussion with the idea of movement in space, seeing things like performance art and a number of other conceptual art sensibilities, which led to, you know, about the Manhattan Transcript, which was an investigation about the definition of architecture. Very important because it led to La Villette in 82, when the competition was announced. I felt, let's, instead of inventing my own script, let's take somebody else's script and turn it into something else. So that's the part that's about Bernard Tschumi. But now, when I said about my generation, there was those who were quite irritated by the cliche modern vocabulary, or irritated with the postmodern historicist sort of fashion that was developing, many of them were quite fascinated by the early 20th century avant-garde. And that includes futurism, surrealism, Dada, expressionism, etc. So this eventually, together with a couple people interested in, quote, as one says, continental philosophy, led to that famous exhibition called, you know, Deconstructivist Architecture in 1988. And that started a completely new title. We really bulldozed out of the scene every attempt to continue with postmodern historicism, etc., etc. So this is a little chunk of a period of history which was interesting at the end of the 20th century. And I don't think that the Event Cities series is about that at all. Nevertheless, I think it's also a sort of documentation. And then inevitably, when doing the last volume, Event Cities 5, I realized that some of the questions that I was asking myself were not necessarily as simple to answer as I had done in the earlier volume, where I was very interested in suggesting a cause and effect relationship between how to address an issue, how to address a concept or develop a concept, and arriving at a building. And realize that there was some moment that was not quite explainable through the rational process that one uses in order to prove that one has thought about this, and that. And hence the word poetics came in. I was now I have to admit, very anxious about the use of the word because other people had used it in different modes. And I felt I had very little to do with the Bachelard sort of sensation-oriented sensibility, dare I say. And however great, some of that work was, and some of the philosophy that went with it. And just by looking further into it, I started to realize perhaps my interest for surrealism and the famous statement of the fortuitous meeting the umbrella and the sewing machine on the dissecting table came back. A friend of mine recently passed away, Colin Fournier, asked me, he worked for a short time in the early days of La Villette. We encountered one another again. And he said, Bernard, I've seen you work. And there's some moments when you make a decision which is somewhere not part of the cause and effect. And I get, so during the making of Event Cities 5, I became increasingly aware of that moment and how that moment is not only the departure of an abstraction, a concept, but also the moment when it interacts with the context. And I always loved what the English language does very well, concept, context, content. I then realize that an abstraction, once it is confronted with reality, I mean, a lot of constraints, whether they're material constraints, economic constraints, programmatic constraints, and so on, you try to resolve it in a manner that is logical. So you do that. But there's a moment when you have the possibility, or you find yourself in front of this, in a way, impossibility of deciding which is the right way. In other words, you have that suddenly that moment when you can literally decide whether you're going to do this or that. And the decision itself is that ethical moment of why do you do it? And philosophers have been, and by the way, that doing Event Cities 5, I rediscovered Derrida from that early encounter actually in London in 1975 at first, but then mostly at the time of the Parc de la Villette. And this rediscovery through the bias of a text that Derrida wrote, "What is poetry? Che è la poesia?" written in Italian at first, it's a short text, and I found it first, as usual, it's not easy to read, and then you manage to, and that notion of the responsibility, the ethical responsibility of the architect that transpires out of this poetic notion of something which is entirely gratuitous, but it is not, because you still are responsible. And I found that interesting. I found it a challenge, to the extent that realized that a number of projects throughout the whole Event Cities series were touching about this unexplainable. And that opened a different sort of reading of what the work had tried to be. And it was a very exciting book to do. Very difficult, but very exciting.
Yeah, I can see that. And the La Villette is interesting for me in part because it seems like such a radical departure from that holistic and perhaps rather hubristic approach that modernism, and particularly mid-century modernism, had become weighed down by, where it was totalizing. And La Villette seems to me to be much more about the gaps in between things. And as you say, that seems to mirror, in a way, the beautiful description that you quote from Derrida in Event Cities 5 about the nature of the poetic. And I quoted it, a section of it. The poem, or the poet's function, is to disable memory, disarm culture, know how to forget knowledge, set fire to the library of poetics, which I thought was really fascinating way of thinking about it, and thinking about your own work in that way, where the way I interpreted that was that your work contains all of the architecture, all the aspects or component parts or material of what we understand to be architecture, but at the same time places it in ways that are unsettling and, I suppose, challenging, but also comforting insofar as we can see it as architecture. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. You use the word, which is quite correct, the unsettling. Architecture is supposed to settle everything, right? I find it, yes, some of it is about reassuring and making it comforting, and that's what it is about, but only in part. There's something else about it. The very fact, and I go back to the beginning of our conversation, which I enjoy, is bringing together this abstraction and this materiality. This, by the way, the word poetics also means the art of making, and this the architecture is the art of making in many ways. And so, as a result, looking at it as something which is beyond making solid buildings that produce shelter and dwelling and part of the economy and part of power and various other symbols, but to use it also perhaps to raise the question that takes you to the next step is what I find so fascinating.
Yes. You've mentioned this idea of the ethical imperative, this moment, this decision-making moment, which I find an unbelievably rich area to describe, because it is mysterious, actually. I find it mysterious. I find the design process and watching design emerge. I do very little of my own now, small stuff, but very, furniture, basically. But seeing it in my own students' work, this moment where the design decision is made is very fascinating. How does one act, or how have you encountered and engaged with what has become quite a serious context for architecture? Again, perhaps not dissimilar to that moment in 1968, where there was a feeling of revolution and a feeling of turning over of the old way or older ways. We've once again come to a serious, it seems to me, serious moment. How does this design moment, this ethical decision, how does it deal with that seriousness? Can architecture, I suppose, or do you see architecture as having this capacity to address these rather somber themes, some of which you've mentioned, economic inequality or ecological conditions, or any number of things, I suppose?
I hesitate to use the word uncertainty because it's used a lot these days. And also the fact that I'd rather, I'm going to quote a mathematics teacher when I was a teenager, who used to say, intuition is a shortcut of reason. And that always struck me as quite interesting, because the complexity of many architectural projects, especially when they are in an urban context, means that you have so many potential ways to approach it and so many constraints to deal with, right? It's rarely a straitjacket. Of course, there are rules and regulation that tends to, shoebox-like result. But in reality, there's always more ways than one thinks. And so that's perhaps also a way we work in the office, play what I call in French, la case vide, the empty slot. Looks at the number of permutation and transformation that are possible in a sort of grid-like game of permutations and transformation. And so you realize that at one moment, your brain and your hand are faster than any other sort of rational processes. And this is a very strange thing. And that's where I touch upon, again, the poetics, this art of the impossible. And La Villette was a slightly different process, but it had certain similarities.
Yes. How does this work, this sort of work, and there seems to me to be, in the way you describe the work, as I put in my notes to you, a sense of architecture as an insurgent practice, something that is a mechanism for reflecting back to the city what the city is or might be. How does a building, in your practice, in your thinking, I suppose, encounter and address its urban and civic responsibility in a way that goes beyond the act of critique, but then becomes a mechanism for, I suppose, healing and stitching a city back together?
I like the way you have brought together but differentiated the word urban and the word civic.
Mm-hmm.
They're not quite synonymous. Urban is evolving enormously these days. What is the definition of a city? In my own, let's say, I'll say, I wouldn't say lifetime, but several decades, the definition of cities have changed. Mm-hmm. In terms of the notion of density, for example, the notion of organization has entirely changed. Let's say, if I look, even the city of New York has entirely changed in the way it is used mm-hmm. from the way it was, let's say, half a century ago. It's due to certain economic processes. It's due, of course, to new modes of exchanges. I'm talking about commercial, I see here hundreds of miles of streets without shops because people get it on delivery by Amazon or whatever. So so the definition of the territory has changed. The way it is used has changed. I would say even the social mix is changing to ways that are not necessarily for the better. So that's where suddenly there is a question about the coherent history on one hand that will interest historian, but then there is the political history that is very, very different, which is taking place. And so as a result, we enter your other world, the world of the civic. And somehow architecture plays a little role there, very small, but it does. And the whole question of, I'm quoting myself, of saying that we do not produce events, but we may somehow let them do things that allow them to generate themselves, encounters and so on. And that was, of course, the general theme of La Villette, but it's been the theme of a great number of projects ever since.
I wanted to finish with one last thing, which is about your modes of representation. Your drawings are beautiful, and obviously La Villette's drawings are very famous, but a lot of your way of presenting things has been very designerly, very aesthetic, very elegant, and very unique. Has there been, as a third part of this relationship that you've got your writing and you've got your buildings, and then there's these drawings. Do these drawings sit as are they a design device? Are they a representational device? How does, particularly those, I suppose, more formal drawings, how do you view them? What are they doing, for want of a better word? Are they making beautiful? Are they an aestheticization of a concept?
You know something? You are embarrassing me right now. Embarrassing me with the compliment and embarrassing me with my difficulty is answering
I'm sorry.
No, finding an answer. Certainly, there is one part which is communicating a concept, communicating an idea. First of all, to myself. Also, immediately in terms of a conversation with others and we are actually also a team of people working and exchanging certain quick ideas, and a few scratches on a sheet of paper are very effective. Also, I travel a lot, and the number of pieces of work that have been done on a sheet of paper format, A4 or 11 by 8.5 by 11 inches on my knee in a taxi or in an airplane or in the subway going to Colombia, going to teach, right? I've done an enormous amount of work like that. So these tend, whether they are done by hand or then drawn according to a certain level of, how can I say, of diagrammatic skill. In other words, trying to express in as few lines as you can I hate to use the word essence, but the very clarity of the project, right? And so there is not an attempt per se to design for visual beauty, but sure, editing is a great part of it. There's some things you keep, something you dump. We just opened literally a couple of days ago, a week ago on a Wednesday in Paris, the Institute of France gave us major prize called the Beaux-Arts Prize, which is a strange name for an architect. I developed, a small exhibition in that context, and using a lot of the hand sketches in order to show that shortcut. They're all shortcuts in a way. And that notion of the clarity of the concept is probably one that is very important still, even though quite often that concept may be unexplicable.
Do you see, as a final, do you see your work? Do you understand your work in continuity? You spoke at the very beginning about a kind of an awareness of your and a kind of emergence of your architectural understanding over time and through history, and your architectural imagination, I suppose, sits within that. Do you see your work in that continuity, or is it a moment of disjuncture that's wrestling with this completely new paradigm? And if it is this moment of rupture, or if it's this moment of continuity, where does it go from here?
You see my hesitation. I think there's some inevitable continuity. You don't reinvent, the world on every Monday morning. Yeah. There's so many things that are I think in a fascinating way, part of the incredible rich history and repository of ideas that exist in architecture. And inevitably, You may invent new things, but you reinvent others. And I see a continuity in what, some people, whether through their writing, from Alberti or Brunelleschi, when he does that dome, that do interest me still at this time. And various period of architectural history are, to me, still very fresh. So that will be the continuity part. The discontinuity, the disjunction is inescapable. Again, back to that point of the concept and the experience, or the concept and the materiality, depend how we bring. It's not about polarities. It's not about yes and no. It's simply about the fact that the nature of those different moments of what architecture is leads to an unpredictable potential or possibility, invent the impossible again. And so that's what I hope it is as well.
Beautiful. Well, that's a perfect point to finish on, Bernard. Thank you so very, very much.
Well, thank you, Ambrose, for this conversation.
As LL Cool J actually said, postmodern is contemporary whatever. There be gold in that hip-hop, I tell thee. Thank you to Bernard for taking the time to speak with me. It was a real honour and a pleasure. Thank you also to Greg Barton at Tschumi Architects for facilitating it and for providing me with the material that I needed. Thank you to MIT for the book too. It is, as you would expect, a glorious publication. Please see the podcast description for links to it, and to Bernard's practice, although you probably can find that with a fairly simple Google search. If you're new here, have a look around. There are clear of 130 excellent conversations with established and emerging scholars, artists, practitioners, and, well, dreamers from all over the world. Think of it as your own personal intellectual Parc de la Villette. And thanks for listening.